It seems like a brown bag without Walter here.
It is difficult to have a brown bag without Walter here, but we must carry on.
And there are no brown bags.
There are not. Although I suppose some left that someone has brought, so it's in the tradition. Well, everyone, I'd like to welcome you to our first hybrid brown bag in this exciting new world that we live in here in pandemic times. I'm Jamie Goodrich, the director of the Humanities Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to hear a talk entitled "What is Metaphysics and How is it Possible?" by Professor Lawrence Lombard of the Philosophy Department. And I don't know that anyone really needs an introduction to Professor Lombard. He is a fixture of this campus. He's a fixture of this institution. And he's known widely across campus for his fierce commitment to the philosophical rigor of critical thinking. But I will go ahead and introduce him anyway. He received his AB from Cornell University and his PhD from Stanford. He's the author of a book entitled "Events, a Metaphysical Study," and over 30 journal articles, chapters, reviews, and encyclopedia entries on metaphysical issues concerning events, actions, identity, change, causation, and time. He has spent his entire professional career at Wayne State and will be retiring at the end of this semester after 54 years.
Should we clap, bang, cry, what?
Tissues will be gratefully accepted.
Sedona, his fox red Labrador retriever, who I've got this beautiful part of, thinks that he should be spending less time on metaphysics and more time playing fetch with her in the park. And I think that will be on the menu after he retires.
Okay.
But today we're learning what is metaphysics and how is it possible? And so I will let Professor Lombard take it away.
Thank you. A long time ago, as was just mentioned, I wrote a book on the metaphysics of events. And when I learned that a local bookstore was the first in the area to carry it, I immediately drove there to stare at it. I went to the philosophy section and there it was. I happened to turn around and I noticed a bookcase with the word metaphysics on top of it. And I wondered why my book wasn't shelved there. And then I saw why. The books shelved in the metaphysics bookcase were books on astrology, tea leaf reading, discovering the meaning of life by examining eagle droppings, past life experiences, transmigration of souls, and the beneficent powers of pyramids. I actually had a 30-minute, moderately heated discussion with the manager about the misuse of a perfectly good word for a perfectly respectable discipline in philosophy to describe a lot of occult nonsense. In case you're interested, I lost. Nevertheless, what is this discipline whose integrity I was so eager to defend? The history of metaphysics and philosophy generally in the Western world contrasts sharply with that of physics, despite the fact that they both began at the same place and time in ancient Greece during the 6th century before the Common Era, and by and large by the same guy named Thales. Both saw themselves as disciplines aimed at the discovery of truths, and indeed were not sharply distinguished from one another. However, it took 2 millennia until the time of Galileo before physicists even learned how to ask the right questions and to find the right methods. Why it took so long, I think, is a very interesting question. It was, I think, mainly geometry's fault. But once they did, answers, better and better ones, came fast and furious. On the other hand, by the time of Aristotle's death in 322 before the Common Era, virtually all the questions of philosophy had been asked in exactly the right way and dealt with by exactly the right method. And we've been spending the last 24 centuries trying to answer them. Apart from an occasional revolution, physics is cumulative, building new results on the basis of old. Discarded theories like geocentric astronomy and the phlogiston theory of fire belong to the history of physics. And the history of physics isn't physics, it's history. Not so with philosophy. The history of philosophy is itself philosophy, in that one cannot report philosophy's history without actively taking sides on the goodness or badness of philosophical arguments, and that's doing philosophy. So philosophers, it seems, must always start from scratch, and our conversations are not only with our contemporaries, but also with our predecessors. Thus, there is the appearance that philosophy makes no progress. These apparently depressing comparisons between philosophy and physics encourage the thought that philosophy, and with it metaphysics, gets nowhere and should be abandoned. Indeed, variations on this thought have sometimes occurred to metaphysicians themselves. It happened first, even before Plato, when the discipline was only 200 years old. It happened again in the 18th century with Hume, and it happened during the decades between the two world wars at the hands of the logical positivists. The so-called postmodernist rejection of metaphysics is really just an extension of the positivist movement with much the same philosophical roots. It often adds, however, a delightfully self-defeating skepticism about the very concept of objective truth. It's self-defeating because if there are no objective truths, then the view that there are no objective truths is itself not objectively true. But if so, then the view that there are no objectively truths is of no interest whatsoever. So what is this thing called metaphysics, and how is it possible for it to be such a truth-seeking discipline? Before tackling these questions, I want to tell two cautionary tales. The first is apocryphal, the second probably not. Story one. After years of extensive and exhaustive research involving the careful measurement of the ratio of body weight to wingspan, meticulous measurements taken in wind tunnels, and so on, aeronautical engineers have shown conclusively that honeybees cannot fly. The honeybees, however, not keeping up with the latest research in the professional journal, go on flying anyway. Story two is related by Plato in the Apology. Socrates is described as annoyingly questioning the leading Athenian intellectuals of his day, discovering that, for example, while the poet can write beautiful poems and the politician can make just laws, when they are asked what beauty and justice are, they are reduced to babbling idiots. Socrates would undoubtedly have discovered pretty much the same thing had he questioned the great metaphysicians about how their subject was to be defined. Actually, in an important sense, he did, and he concluded that metaphysics should be given up. We're going to have that argument later. That fact notwithstanding, despite the fact that we do keep up with our reading in the professional journals, we metaphysicians go on flying anyway. However, we should be prepared to deal with that question, lest we appear no wiser than Socrates' fool Euthyphro in the dialogue that bears his name, or his generalized cousin Idiotus. Metaphysics seems to be a response to what is fundamentally an epistemological crisis. The world we experience appears to us infinitely varied. No two things ever look exactly the same, and even the same thing will look different from one occasion or vantage point to another. The crisis this engenders is one of understanding and explanation, because on a plausible model, we understand and can explain things to the extent that we see them as fundamentally like things that we already understand and can explain. Indeed, one of Newton's great achievements was in showing that what appear to be utterly disparate phenomena, an apple's falling towards the earth and the moon's not falling towards the earth, are in fact examples of the very same type of phenomenon and are to be explained in precisely the same way. Since we understand and complain and explain just to the degree that we can find things to be fundamentally alike, the apparent infinite diversity we experience threatens to make the world unintelligible and inexplicable. So if the world, or at least some huge chunk of it, is intelligible, an assumption that all disciplines that aim at the discovery of truths about the world make, then the world is not the way it appears. For it appears diverse, and yet if it is to be intelligible, it must be unified. So it seems that the truths about how the world appears and the truths about how the world is contradict each other. This has encouraged some to divide the world into two distinct worlds, a world of appearances and a world of reality. The metaphysician is then asked to find a way to cut through the former in order to get at the latter. The world as it really is, independent of the way it appears. But if this view of the nature of metaphysics were correct, the subject would be confronted with a staggering and I think fatal difficulty. Given that we humans come into this world without very much, if any, knowledge of the world, we are faced with the fact that all such knowledge comes through the senses. Thus, it seems as though all we can really know about the world is how it appears. For what else can we learn through the use of the senses but how things look, feel, smell, taste, and sound? And if that is so, then the task of metaphysics, that of figuring out how the world really is independent of the way it appears to be impossible and therefore pointless. There may indeed be truths about how the world is, but we are prevented from getting at them by the fact that we have no way to see how the world is without looking. Thus, as a search for truths about how the world is, metaphysics can at best only be a purely and pointlessly speculative enterprise, whose pronouncements forever lack any evidentiary support. And frankly, that's not an enterprise I want to be involved in, nor I think has any serious metaphysician I know of, past or present. Is there a way to explain the metaphysical enterprise that shows that it's not purely speculative and which allows that there are truths about how the world really is, which we can with some serious effort discover? Yes, there is. And I think it is the conception that has, I believe, motivated, perhaps without complete awareness, metaphysicians since at least the days of Plato and Aristotle. Kant thought otherwise about the history of philosophy, but he was wrong. The idea that metaphysics is impossible because it is an attempt to discover truths about something to which we have no evidentiary access rests on the assumption that the world may very well be fundamentally different from the way it appears. However, if metaphysics is impossible for that reason, then so is every intellectual endeavor that aims at objective truths, because all such disciplines rely on evidence that begins with the senses. If the senses give us knowledge only of how things appear, then not only is metaphysics impossible, but so also are history, physics, psychology, and all the rest, including the dictates of ordinary common sense. But this is absurd, and nobody can believe this or take the profession of such a viewpoint seriously. Much more importantly, we can have no evidence whatsoever for the claim that the world is different from the way it appears. How could we? Having such evidence would require that we have a source of information about how the world is that is independent of the source of our information about how it appears, so that we can then compare the information so gotten and judge that the world is indeed different from the way it appears. But if all substantive knowledge of the world begins with the senses, we can't do that. It is somewhat like looking at a second copy of a book to see whether what the first copy said was true. We ought to get that one. So the claim that at the root of skepticism about the possibility of metaphysics cannot be shown to be true. Of course, for precisely the same reason, it cannot be shown to be false either. So for the sake of all truth-seeking disciplines, let's assume that the world is, by and large, just the way it appears to be, that most of our beliefs are true. But if that assumption is granted, and if it seems reasonable, the way things appear to be is discovered by the sophisticated and ordinary use of the senses, that is, by science and common sense, then there would seem to be no distinctively metaphysical issues. So is there any work for the metaphysician to do? There is, and there's plenty of it. To see this, the first thing to understand is that metaphysics is in many methodological respects more like mathematics than it is like physics, in that we are not concerned with the discovery of new information about the world by induction. Physics is not an empirical science. Metaphysics is not an empirical science, though there is a place for induction in deciding among competing philosophical theories. Aristotle remarked, if the standard translations are correct, that all knowledge begins in wonder. Metaphysical knowledge, I think may not. We wonder why the sky is blue, whether or not we'll get tenure, whether or not we'll have enough money to retire on, and who wrote the Book of Love. We wonder about such things because we do not know what the relevant facts are. Our sense of wonder is what drives us to do science in the broadest sense of that word. It is the attitude with which we confront original intellectual sin, ignorance. What drives us to philosophy, however, is not ignorance, but puzzlement. That attitude is awakened in us when we discover not that we have too little information, but that we appear to have too much. But how can we ever have too much information? We appear to have too much information when the information we have seems to be such that it is impossible for all of it to be correct, when the information we have appears contradictory. But if the world is by and large just the way we think it to be, then the information we have is, for the most part, correct. That is, that information truly describes the world as it really is, not just as it merely appears. But nothing exists about which contradictory things can be truly said. The world cannot be impossible. Thus, given that it appears to be the case that the information we have about the world is contradictory, then the world appears to be impossible and therefore cannot exist. But since the world really does, the information we have cannot really be inconsistent. It can only appear to be so. Thus, the job of the metaphysician is to explain how it is possible for the information we have to be correct, despite the fact that it appears that that information could not be. The job is to secure the possibility of the world by explaining away the appearance of its impossibility. A metaphysical question thus has the form, what must the world be like if the world is by and large just the way we think it to be, despite the fact that the way we think the world to be appears to be impossible? A metaphysical problem is thus a problem that is not the result of ignorance of the facts, but of a failure to understand them. The solution to a metaphysical problem then involves the securing of what we already know from other sources against the threat of impossibility. The possibility of the world may be secured by the discovery that the world contains things that we were not aware that it contained, or that the things of the world are different from the way we commonly think them to be. It may also be secured by the discovery of new ways of understanding what we know about things. Usually a combination of these discoveries is involved. For example, consider what is perhaps the oldest metaphysical problem, the problem of change. In fact, it was the failure to resolve the conflict between Heraclitus's and Parmenides' views about change that was a chief cause of the abandonment of metaphysics and philosophy generally by Socrates, before Plato's attempted revival of the subject. The table before it was brown. The table that was here last week was red. So the table that was here a week ago, so is the table that was here a week ago the same as the table that's here now? Well, of course it's the same. No one came in here and replaced it with another, much like it, but for its color. Of course, it's not the same. After all, what is before us is a brown table, not a red table. Therefore, the table before us is both the same as and different from the table that was here a week ago. But that appears to be impossible. How can something be both the same and different? We have what appears to be a contradiction. If the world is the way it appears, then it is true both that the table before us really is the same as the table that was here last week, and that the table before us really is different from the table that was here last week. But that seems impossible. Since the world can't be impossible, either the table before us really isn't the same as the table that was here last week, or it really isn't different, or that the appearance of impossibility isn't real. But to deny that the table that was here last week and the table that's here now are the same, or to deny that they are different, is to admit that the world is by and large not the way it appears, even its most basic and apparently most easily accessible level. This amounts to a denial of our ability to know anything at all, which contradicts the assumption that the world is intelligible. However, it should be noticed that denying that the appearance of contradiction isn't real is importantly different from the others, for it is a claim not about the world, but about us. It is a claim that results not from our sensory confrontation with the world, but from our reflection on our own beliefs. We can give up that claim without giving up our belief that the world is the way it appears. For in giving that claim up, we only admit that we are mistaken about what we take to be impossible. As someone once remarked in another context, perhaps someone here can identify the source. This is, after all, the Humanities Center. The fault lies not in our stars, but in ourselves. All right, we'll get an answer to that during the discussion.
Can we Google it?
No. So the path to a solution to the problem of change begins with an explanation for how it is possible for us and the table that was here last week to be both the same and different. We are to explain what the world must be like in order for it to be possible for the world to be by and large just the way it appears to be, despite the fact that it appears impossible for it to be that way. Of course, the beginning of wisdom here is to say that we are not really contradicting ourselves when the table that was here last week and the table that was here now, that's here now, are both the same and different. We are saying that they are identical but dissimilar. That is only the beginning of wisdom. For how is it possible for a thing to be dissimilar from itself? The solution to a metaphysical problem may very well involve the discovery that there are things in the world that there don't appear to be, at least not at first or second glance. For example, some hold that the solution to the problem of change requires that things like tables have temporal parts, such as the last Wednesday part, as well as this Wednesday part, in much the same way that the table has spatial parts like legs, and that what are different are the temporal parts, while what is the same is the thing composed of those temporal parts. Now, I myself think that that solution is quite mad, but whether or not I'm right about this, what this shows is that while the general form of a metaphysical question appears to be a quite conservative one, we are, after all, trying to show how it is possible for things to be by and large the way they appear to us to be, the way we think them to be. The answers to metaphysical questions may not be conservative at all. This conception of metaphysics explains why it is that this subject is not a part of the empirical sciences, however broadly construed. The metaphysician's task is not to discover new empirical knowledge about the world, and that is why the empirical methods of the sciences are largely inappropriate to metaphysical pursuits. Since what prompts us to solve metaphysical problems is not ignorance of the scientific fact, the discovery of new such facts is not going to solve them. This explains why it is that virtually no new philosophical problems have arisen since the time of Aristotle, and why it is that the history of philosophy is not mere history, that philosophers continue to have profitable discussions with the great philosophers of the past. Their reflections were not crucially tied to the knowledge of their day, and so their reflections can aid us in our attempt to resolve the apparent contradictions that arise in our contemplation of our beliefs about the world, for by and large, their beliefs are ours. In a way, metaphysics, and indeed philosophy generally, is unique among the truth-seeking disciplines. Even if there were no thinking creatures in the universe, it would still be a fact, for example, that bodies attract each other with a force more or less directly proportional to their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. Even without thinking beings, there are the truths of physics. Without thinking creatures, however, there would be no philosophical problems. For philosophical problems are problems about how it is possible for there to be, by and large, but how it is possible for the world to be, by and large, just the way thinking creatures believe it to be, despite the fact that it appears to those creatures to be impossible. There would be no philosophical problems where there are not conscious creatures who not only had beliefs about the world, that is, creatures to whom the world appears, but who are also self-conscious enough to reflect on those beliefs and to see that those beliefs appear to conflict. The enterprise of metaphysics, then, appears to be responsive to the highest, most complex, and dare I say, most narcissistic of our cognitive capacities, the capacity to think about and reflect on ourselves. Thank you.
Like to open the floor to questions.
Julius Caesar, Act 1, Scene 3. There'll be a quiz.
Thank you for that.
It's the last question I'll know how to answer correctly.
I've got one. I've got two, actually. I have a history question and then a scientific question. So, I mean, I'm kind of happy to say that the whole Kantian apparatus is absurd, but I wouldn't have thought that the problem with it is that Kant's view that like Leibnizian metaphysics doesn't work, or the metaphysics of substances or Wolffianism or whatever implies that there can't be history and physics.
No. What I was trying to say, however, clumsily, was that I think what Kant got wrong was what happened in the history of philosophy, in particular metaphysics. I think he thought that everybody was doing this thing that couldn't be done, trying to find out how things are really in themselves, where we have only the use of the senses, and whereas what they should have been doing all along is figuring out how the world must appear. I think that he just got that bit of history wrong. What else he got right? Right.
I see. So the thought is, if he were right to attribute that to Aristotle, then he would have to say the same thing about Newton, but he didn't want to.
Not sure I see the connection.
I mean, he has a whole story to tell about the non-empirical character of like the a priori metaphysics of the soul and so on. And you're saying that he was wrong to think that, for example, Leibniz was doing something non-empirical.
No. What I was saying was that he had a view about what all these metaphysicians were doing before him.
Right.
Namely, trying to figure out how the world is utterly independent of how it appears. That's why they never got anywhere, because as he pointed out, Hume was right. We have no access to the world independent of the way it appears.
Okay.
He just interpreted the history of metaphysics wrong.
Got it.
He said, what they should have been doing is what I am now about to start doing. Namely figuring out how the world must appear.
Right. And so you don't think that that's true of Leibniz? You think he was using evidence to
I
make
think
conjectures about
Leibniz and Aristotle and Hegel and everybody else, including Kant, was doing exactly what I said they were doing, namely figuring out how the world must be, despite the fact that it appears to be impossible. The clue is in Aristotle, I think. Aristotle, about every other page, says being is said in many ways. So on the one hand, we use the word being in one sense, and another says, oh yeah, but in another sense, which we haven't discovered yet, we deny that, and we have an apparent contradiction. Oh, but being is said in many ways, so the contradiction goes away. Right? That's what Aristotle was doing. I think that's what they were all doing. And that's what I've been trying to describe. I don't know to the extent to which any one of those wonderful figures in the history of philosophy would have said, yeah, that's what I've been trying to do. It's just that that's how I reconstruct what they're doing, so that it makes the task of metaphysics impossible, both possible and interesting. I don't arm wrestle.
I'm just gonna go. So the picture of what metaphysics is for you, it was something like, at least part of it was trying to salvage some sort of explanation for how the world can be as it appears, something like this.
Yeah. An elaborate defense of common sense.
Yeah. So I think there's an analogous move that some epistemologists make. Where they say,
agree.
oh yeah, epistemology is about ultimately showing how we can have knowledge, how we do have a good evidentiary position, something like that. I tend to not feel that's what I'm doing as an epistemologist. So I wonder in an analogous sort of way, if there's something else one could be saying they're doing as a metaphysician. I think as an epistemologist, my question isn't how do we salvage knowledge and show that we have lots. It's an open question. Do I have any knowledge?
Yeah.
Could I actually
Yeah.
be in a good evidentiary position? There's sort of not a thumb on the scale that at the end of the day, we're going to get the knowledge back. So too, it seems like in a way, your conception of metaphysics might be contentious. Maybe not. Maybe all metaphysicians actually agree with you that
Oh,
you're
no.
trying to salvage.
Oh, good Lord, no.
So I guess the question is, on what grounds, or in what sense are you saying metaphysics is this sort of like appearance preserving task rather than something more?
Yeah, I think
broad?
all philosophy is like that. We disagree about epistemology. My view is really that, oh, Bruce, you're gonna love this, that skepticism is the view that philosophy is impossible and let's give up. Right. Right.
Skepticism is also said in many ways.
And skepticism is said in but yes, it seems to me that the question for epistemology is, how is it possible for us to know all the stuff that we think we know, despite the fact that it looks impossible for us to have that kind of knowledge? And that means, we have to get clear about just what knowledge is, what evidence is, what certainty is, and so on and so on. They're all concept clarifying enterprises to defend the possibility, to defend the claim that it's actual, that we know all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
So then I'm wondering what kind of, I don't know, you didn't necessarily say you were giving a definition of metaphysics, but to the extent that you were sort of doing something.
Yeah, it's sort of.
Should this definition be understood as something like an ameliorative definition, or something like conceptual ethics or conceptual engineering? So by which I mean, one kind of definition you can give is sort of like figure out what the people currently mean, and just say that's the thing, you know. Or you can say something normative. I want to define my.
I don't want to be saying, here's how I think metaphysicians ought to behave in the future. That's what I think Kant was doing.
Okay.
Right. Okay. No, my idea is this. That is, I think that I am and others are intellectual descendants of Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas and Duns Scotus and Descartes and all these philosophers. I think I stand in a line of succession with these people, and the assumption is we're all doing the same thing. What is it? So on one hand, it's a descriptive task. What one task could I describe that would in fact fit all these folk? And on the other hand, well. And I mean, there are descriptions you could give that would fit, that would show that what we've all been doing for the last 2,600 years is utter nonsense. We should give it up. All right. I wonder what is it that we could all be said to be doing? It's also a matter of rational reconstruction, right? That is, right. How can I understand what they're doing so that it makes sense to doing it, right? In just the same way that I don't take seriously interpretations of philosophers who, according to which they deny the existence of physical objects. I mean, philosophers just ain't that stupid, and they're not that silly. So Berkeley didn't deny the existence of physical objects, and hence he was not refuted by somebody going and kicking a stone. It's that what Berkeley was, of course there are physical objects. You just don't understand what they are. They're just a bunch of perceptions in your head. Okay. So you're the skeptic, right? I'm the one who thinks that they're real because nobody can deny that there are these. So what I'm trying to do is reconstruct the metaphysical enterprise in light of the way in which philosophers have done metaphysics over the past 2,600 years, so that it actually makes sense, so that there's a job that they're actually doing that's actually doable. So I don't think this is a recommendation. It's a description and reconstruction.
I wonder if I can get in on the conversation. Howdy. So Larry, I pretty much agree with everything you say. I think you say some things that are ambiguous, so I want to bring this out. So you say rightly, I think there seems to be among the appearances contradictions. How could it be both this way and that way? And so it's a puzzle. And what you say is you want us that we're looking for some answer about how the world really is, even though the appearances seem to be contradictory. In a way, that's true, but I want to contrast the example of the blind man and the elephant with what philosophers are interested in when it comes to appearances. So the blind men think they feel just one part of the elephant. One thinks it's like a rope, one like a tree, and one like a snake, depending on what part they feel. And it seems impossible. How could an animal be three different things? And then there's an answer. It's an elephant. An elephant has these various parts, and that's a kind of empirical theory to explain the apparently contradictory observations. But I think philosophy is also puzzled about how could the table be the same and different over time as it changes, I don't know, maybe its shape or its color or whatever. And those are puzzles. But I think the difference is that philosophers are looking for necessary truths about sameness, say, and the other kind of truth that comes out with the elephant example is it's just contingent. It happens to be an elephant, it explains it. That's the way the world really is. But the world that philosophers in general are interested in, and metaphysicians in particular, I think, has nothing to do, well, that's too strong, is about what is necessarily true and what's possibly true. And to make Marx, to bring it back to epistemology and even ethics, I think what we're wondering about, what are the necessary truths about the nature of knowledge? It's not a question about whether we have knowledge, given that this analysis is correct. That's an empirical question. But what are the necessary and sufficient conditions of knowledge, and what is a necessary biconditional? And if you do ethics, you're wondering about, in triage, it seems like you should save the most people. In transplant, where you have to kill somebody in order to get his organs to transplant into 5 people to save their lives, how can it be that it's right in triage to save the most, but wrong in transplant? It's a puzzle, but you're not going to find the answer to that puzzle in any observations or empirical evidence. So philosophy is about necessary truths and possible ones, about how the world of necessary truths is, not about how the world is when it comes to contingent truths. So what I'm saying, Larry, I agree with you that philosophy begins in puzzles, but it doesn't think that the solution to those puzzles can be given by contingent truths.
And nobody in this room ever said that.
No, you didn't. I didn't disagree with you, Larry. I'm just saying.
Let me actually deal with what, of course, I think the problem of epistemology is exactly what I said it was. And therefore, we have these puzzles about, yes, you know it, no, you don't, seen with the same set of facts. So what we need to do is resolve the apparent contradiction by asking, well, what's knowledge? That requires, right, conceptual analysis to get some necessarily true biconditional, right? That gives an analysis of the concept of knowledge. And we want to do the same for the concept of evidence and the concept of certainty and the concept of whatever else that generates these apparent epistemological problems in just the same way I need the necessary and sufficient conditions for the concept of change or the concept of an event or the concept of a cause or whatever. So the goal, right? The goal is to have a set of concepts and distinctions sufficient to explain away the appearance of impossibility, but that body of ammunition will be, by and large, consist of a lot of necessary truths about concepts. Conceptual analysis is the tool I use, right? Right.
I agree. Remember, Larry, I said I agree with everything you say, but that I thought that the way you put it sometimes is misleading, because you say it begins with puzzles because the appearances seem to be contradictory, but we want a solution that tells us how the world is pretty much the way we think it is. Some people can interpret that to mean, oh, he wants to give the answer to the blind man problem. But there are 2 ways that it can be different. In philosophy, it really doesn't make a damn bit of difference what the observations are. It matters hypothetical cases. I always say to my student, who cares? Just think of hypothetical cases in epistemology. That's how Gettier cases came about. Who cares? There's no case of a sheep in a field, where some farmer put poodles out there and made them look like sheep. It doesn't matter. The data for philosophy has nothing to do with observations. But your characterization, I know we agree, Larry, but I'm just saying your characterization allows the misinterpretation of what you're saying to think, oh, well, if you solved the blind man problem, you would be doing philosophy. And of course, you don't believe that. We agree.
Yeah.
I'm just saying what you say is misleading because it
Yeah,
doesn't distinguish the blind man problem from the hypothetical cases that philosophers are really interested in. I don't give a damn what the actual observations are in any discipline in philosophy.
Okay.
Who cares?
So confused.
Who gives a shit about real philosophy? Doesn't care it's applied
What's
philosophy.
what's
Once you've analyzed
law-
right and wrong,
what-
knowledge and not knowledge, what's the same and not same, what is this personal identity, then it's all applied philosophy. Hooray! I'm all for applied philosophy. But the fundamental part of philosophy has nothing to do with that application. It has to do with what are the necessary truths about knowledge, personal identity in general, and all those things in philosophy. They're just about necessary truths. That's the.
I'm gonna
You agree, Larry?
Larry.
You agree?
I'm gonna-
You just don't make this point.
Yes.
No, you do make the
Yeah.
point. You allow
Maybe
the other
don't even try it.
interpretation.
They do this.
So,
This is why they kill
so
philosophers,
what's
right?
large, gray, and saying
I always come back.
the jazz and pop songs? It
Say that again,
relates to
sorry.
elephants,
Oh, I was close.
I know, yeah.
I want to break in here because I know that Eric had a question, but I also saw a question down at the other end of the table. So I want to make sure those individuals get a chance to ask their questions.
I had one, but I think it's fine. Go.
I was just thinking that the conception of the problem that you think metaphysics is solving is too strong, and therefore your conception of what it is too weak. It doesn't. So you say that it arises from puzzlement that's an outright contradiction in common sense, and then the task of metaphysics is to explain how everything can be as we always thought it was, like a consistency proof or something like that. And Mark was saying, I think epistemology is doing more than that. And I think metaphysics is doing more than that. So, for example, you can worry about how does consciousness fit into a physical world, or a mostly physical world, at least mostly physical. And in doing that, do you have to have an outright contradiction that says it must be this way and it can't be that way?
Yeah.
No, you don't. You just have a puzzle. You just have a problem. You have a problem of, wow, how do these things
Okay.
fit together?
I mean,
And
But look,
the solution.
this
is-
combination,
The solution is not to show that these things are merely consistent, it's to come up with a more explanatory.
no, they're all questions of the Kantian sort. How is such and such possible? Okay. Here's a piece of plastic, here's a bit of this, it isn't conscious. Here's some wood, here's some metal, here's some this, here's some that. It ain't conscious. Here's a bunch of carbon and proton and oxygen and this, and it is conscious. How is it possible for a lump of physical stuff to be conscious? It does, all right.
But
On the one hand, it doesn't look as if it appears to be the case that consciousness properties can't be properties of merely physical stuff, yet it is, to me, obvious that it is. We have an apparent contradiction. And what philosophers of mind are up to, I think, can be interpreted as an attempt to show how it's possible for purely physical stuff to be conscious. Now, the Cartesians will come and scream, you don't have to bother doing that because there's this other stuff. Well, now we have another metaphysical problem.
I actually think it's different than that. The problems, one set of problems people worry about is how could you show that physical stuff arranged in the right way and of the right sorts would have to be conscious. It's not a matter of merely showing consistency. It's a matter of showing a necessary connection.
That might,
So that's like.
that
that's
might
a
emerge as
stronger-
well. I don't have any problem
So
with that.
you don't need an outright contradiction to get the problem.
No, you just need the
of an
appearance of it.
explanation going, and you don't need, or rather, you need more than a consistency proof to give a solution.
No, I didn't say,
So what I'm getting at it though is that your conception of metaphysics seems overly small. It's like you're just trying to show that what we already thought is consistent. We want something more.
oh, but there's nothing,
broad and
that- yeah,
explanatory.
there's nothing that stops us from going beyond here and showing, okay. For
Well, but it
example,
wouldn't be
that is, we would,
by your
I
definition.
mean, how would we, I mean, I'm trying to imagine what the philosophy of mind would look like if it just established that it was possible for a lump of physical stuff to be conscious.
That's a common view. That's a.
What's a common view? That a lump of physical stuff.
So
No.
a common view is a kind of.
Let me finish my answer. I mean, I'm trying to imagine what it would be like for somebody to have established. Yes, it's possible for a lump of physical stuff to be conscious without going on to say that in fact, the nature of our mental concept is such that physical stuff arranged in a particular way would have to be. That's how it's possible, because it has to be that way. I don't see that as abandoning my project for something else. It's just going on to consider the implications of having established the possibility. It's not just showing consistency, because it's showing consistency by analyzing our concepts, and those analyses will have further implications. If you want to say, okay, then metaphysics includes those further implications, and I haven't allowed for that, okay, I have no problem. But my problem was just, what does it take? What does it take to generate a metaphysical enterprise? Right, and it's not just, what's this concept? Right, and it's not just, right, what's conscious? It's because there are puzzles about consciousness and purely physical things that make us sit down and do these analyses. And once we have them, fat chance, right? Then we go on to discover other things that in fact, right, physical stuff arranged in a certain way would have to become. I have no problem including that in the enterprise. But my concern was, what are the problems, right? How do we get started in the enterprise?
Puzzles, Larry, are not contradictions. That's Eric's
No, they're-
point, and that's my
they're-
point about triage and transplant. Okay, I should have.
No,
Puzzles are not necessarily contradictions. That's the problem. Yes,
they're
puzzles
apparent
are a
contradictions.
source of philosophy. They're not, they needn't be, but they can be contradictions are the puzzles.
well, the transplant and the other case that generates it is a case of an apparent contradiction, because the moral judgment we make in the two cases seem to contradict each other. And we say, how is it possible that in the transplant case, we shouldn't do it, and in the trolley case, we should?
They
How
don't
is that
contradict
possible?
each other. They do not.
They
contradict each
appear,
other.
they appear to.
They do? Only if you're a
Of course.
utilitarian. Utilitarianism is one answer, but otherwise it doesn't they think, I don't know, I'm a Kantian, I don't know what to say about these cases. Or they don't seem to contradict, I'm just puzzled.
I think I have.
Puzzles are broader. Sorry. yeah.
I have a question that's related to all this, because you're wanting to circumscribe metaphysics, but in answers to some of the questions, this is a question I had while you were talking. Do you think this is just a view of what philosophy is, as
By
opposed
and
to what
large.
metaphysics is?
By and large, that these how is it possible questions just are tailored. There's a whole set of how is it possible questions that are about what the world has to be like that generate metaphysics. A whole bunch of how is it possible that generate epistemology. And so that's my inclination. Now,
So
the
how
case of ethics gets harder because
that's where
we're
I was going.
interested not only because philosophers have stopped saying that substantive moral questions don't interest us. We're only interested in the conceptual ones, right? The conceptual ones are ones that I think generate how is it possible questions, but the normative questions may not. Right. So I'm not sure about that. The case in philosophy of religion, yeah, I'm inclined to think that they're generated out of how is it possible questions. Not merely how is it possible questions, but they get generated that way.
Yeah, I was trying to understand ethics with this and philosophy of religion.
Yeah.
Because some questions about like the nature of God. for
Yeah,
example,
well,
don't-
I think in a way, well, first of all, I'm not so convinced that the question of the God properly belongs to the philosophers. I mean,
Right,
why is that
nature of
question
God.
belong to the philosophers, but are there electrons? No, doesn't belong. And I think it's,
Rational
I,
arguments for it that are not-
well, I
just
think,
ontological.
I think an agreement was made between the philosophers and the theologians. The theologians wanted to worry about, right, what happens once you've already assumed that God exists, and they've left the nasty question to us, and we just got stuck with it.
Do you think like
But-
the ontological argument is not a philosophical?
But then the question is, if the question is, what sorts of arguments are being used?
Mhm.
Right, the ontological argument clearly makes the question a philosophical. I'm not so sure about the cosmological arguments. They seem less philosophical than the ontological argument. I mean, there are all sorts of important metaphysical principles are involved.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah,
But
totally.
they're not debating those metaphysical questions, right? It's not at all. The other thing that makes the philosophy of religion, so to speak, squarely in philosophy, is if you start with the problem of evil.
Mhm.
How is it possible that there be an omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent region in the face of that?
Mhm.
Right. Well, the theist must construe this as a straightforward philosophical problem of exactly the Kantian variety. It appears to be impossible that that in the face of the actual facts about evil, that there could be an individual with these characteristics. And the theist is going to say, yeah, it is, because it is possible, because of such and such reason. So yeah, that would make, that's a way in which the philosophy of religion would grow out of what is clearly a philosophical.
Can I return to that?
Oh, no, God, I already stopped.
There, you seem to agree with Bruce on some of this necessary stuff on metaphysics. I want to see if you'll back off on that. Because, I mean, some of the most interesting stuff, I mean, at least for me, is like some of social ontology. I mean, in a few hours, when we talk about Charles Mills, he talks about the metaphysics of race. And he says that's not necessary, it's clearly contingent, but it's worth studying. So do you think that's still kind of metaphysics proper and worthwhile?
I'm not sure what depending on how you state the problem, then I'll wonder about whether or not it's a metaphysical issue. I mean, here are some facts that the genetic differences among all peoples on the planet are so minor, right? That to pick out one and say, this is really crucial, right? It seems like there could be nothing but a social decision made. Why pick on this one rather than the one that determines that I'm short and he's tall? Right? Right. Why this particular so now it becomes right. Well, now it looks like race is just a social construction. Am I now doing metaphysics? No, I'm just trying to figure out I'm not sure what I'm doing when I worry about that problem in that way. Because I don't think that there's a metaphysical difference between me and the Martians, unless, right? I'm not sure what a metaphysical difference would be between me and the Martians. Right? So I need to know more about how the problem is arising and what we're doing to so-called solve it, rather than just saying, well, people talk about race. What's going on here? that doesn't necessarily make it a metaphysical issue. Okay. It may be conceptual, but not every conceptual issue seems to be metaphysical.
Follow-up question to that,
Yeah.
which is, since metaphysicians of race or gender or some of these other social ontological categories think of themselves and conceptualize it as metaphysics, and it seems to fall outside the bounds of what you think of as metaphysics. Does that mean that your conception of metaphysics is prescriptive after all?
No, not necessarily. At least I hope it is. I just don't know enough of that literature. Well, let me be accurate. I don't know any of that literature. What I'd like to do is take a careful look at the literature and see how the problem is arising. What are the considerations that make us wonder about what's gender, right? What's race, and so on. What are the considerations here? Is it some sort of conceptual confusion, or just, gee, these ideas seem incredibly vague, let's try and get clear about it. Yeah, I don't know what the actual literature, I don't know how these problems sort of, as philosophical, I don't know how they arise. If they arise in the way that I suggest, then it's clearly metaphysical according to me. If it arises in a different way, I don't know whether I need to say, well, look, there are poets who are described as metaphysical poets. Their poetry does not arise in the way. It's just another word, another perfectly good word used in different ways. So
It would be.
so let me put it that metaphysics is what I say it is, plus anything that's sufficiently similar to it. Right. I don't know what's sufficiently similar yet. Maybe it's one of these Wittgenstein family resemblance concepts. I just don't know enough of the literature to know how these problems arise.
I was just gonna say, if they arise in a way that you would consider sufficiently similar, that would, it seems, tell against the idea that metaphysical questions are sort of timeless for human beings in their essence. Since there could be metaphysics of things that come into and out of our ontologies on the basis of contingent social fact.
I wonder about that because certainly when you worry about the metaphysics and epistemology of space and time, there are questions that we raise, that philosophers of space and time raise now about space time that could not have been raised in Aristotle's time, because they didn't have the concept of space time. But when you actually look at the arguments that philosophers throughout history have raised for the claim that space itself exists or time itself exists, and then we look at space-time, the same arguments keep coming up, only they're slightly differently deployed, right? So I'm not so yeah, the metaphysics of space-time could not have been discussed by Aristotle. Well, it wouldn't take much to get him to be able to do it, because he was already discussing he was discussing the concept of space in the same way that modern philosophers of physics are discussing space-time. That's what I mean, that there are really no new philosophical problems. Now, I could be wrong about that we need a whole different set of techniques and so forth. But my inclination is to think that these ancient guys just worried about pretty much everything in exactly the right way. So I need to see how these problems are developing to see whether or not Aristotle could have discussed this problem, or Plato. Is Plato? I mean, he certainly had lots of things to say about gender.
Well, he had a lot to say about women, and men, but not really anything about gender.
Yeah.
As that term refers now.
So yeah, so I'd be interesting to know, if I knew more, whether or not. I mean, yes, there's this new concept that they couldn't have discussed, but are the same philosophical arguments relevant here? Or do we need a whole new set of techniques, whole new set of arguments that Aristotle and Plato and Aquinas and Hegel and would have just been utterly unfamiliar with. My inclination is to think that that probably isn't so, but that's, I say that in part, because I'm fond of my own view, and partly because I don't know enough about these other issues.
Well, on that note, we've hit 1:30, and so I'm sure there is plenty of conversation to be had outside the confines of the brown bag itself, but I'd like to thank everyone for attending and give our speaker a round of applause. And please take some baked goods with you.
Yes, that's the important. Baked goods. Baked goods.